Hello everyone, we are back with the Corolla XRS again and finally doing something that's not just fixing it. Today we are going to be installing a wideband gauge. Now the reason I want to install one is because currently the only way I can view my AFR is by plugging my laptop into the ECU and viewing all the data. But that can be a little bit annoying, especially because the only real place for my laptop to sit while I drive is in the passenger seat, which means the only way I can view the data while I drive is by looking way over here and then turning back towards the road, which, one, I guess is not extremely safe, and two, it's a little bit inconvenient, especially since I don't always want to plug in my laptop every time I drive. And viewing the AFR is going to be important because this car is no longer stock, it has forced induction, so if something goes wrong, I probably won't know until it's too late. So that's what we are going to be installing this gauge for. So I'm going to go ahead and take it out of the box, and don't worry, it's not an unboxing video, I'm just making sure everything is here before we start. Oxygen sensor, wiring harness, the actual gauge, and more wires. Take the actual gauge out, and let's have a look. Now this is the same gauge that I put in the Turbo Corolla. This is a Glowshift boost and wideband gauge since, you know, this car now makes boost, supercharger. So I figured since this gauge has worked pretty well with me in that car, it'll probably work just as well in this car too. So it looks like everything is here, so a quick rundown on how this is going to go. Of course, we're going to have to wire in for power, which I'm going to run it off the radio. It's been working just fine running off the radio for this gauge in the Turbo Corolla, hasn't given me any problems, so I'm going to do the same thing on this car. It's only one gauge, so it shouldn't draw too much power anyway. And then the oxygen sensor, we are going to add another oxygen sensor. Even though this is an LS 4.9, just like the wideband that goes to the ECU, I don't want to tap into the wiring that goes from the O2 to the ECU and run it to the gauge. The gauge won't take tons of power, but with O2 sensors, you want them to be very precise, very accurate, especially with widebands. It's kind of the whole point. So tapping into that one O2 sensor and running it to both the gauge and the ECU just doesn't sound like a good idea to me. The ECU is going to have one oxygen sensor and the gauge itself is going to have another oxygen sensor. Now to add this oxygen sensor, we are going to need to drill a hole in the exhaust, and that's where this comes in. I've actually got two. I'm currently debating on two different places in the exhaust I want to put the O2 sensor. I'm either going to use this large clamp and put it in front of the ECU wideband, or I'm going to use a small one and put it behind the ECU wideband, since the exhaust pipe is two different sizes before and after. However, with both of these, it's still going to be before the cat though, because obviously put it after the cat, it's not going to be as accurate. I suppose you can, but the whole point of having a wideband gauge is to be accurate. And then to finish it off, this here is going to go on the dashboard and the gauge is going to pop into there. And then that'll be all said and done. Right, I think that's everything on the table covered, and now we can proceed with the install, starting with the wiring. Alright, first order of business is to disconnect the battery, since we are going to be messing with wires in the car. And for good measure, I am also going to disconnect the positive terminal as well. And there we go. So just like in the Turbo Corolla here, I plan on putting the gauge right here, which means that to do the wiring, we're first going to have to remove the A-pillar, or this A-pillar panel, and out it comes. Probably also going to tie this microphone wire out of the way too. Let's take the shift knob off and pull this panel, then pull this knob, and now we can remove the screws. And now this panel can come out, and we'll disconnect all of the plugs here. And the last one, there. Panel around the radio comes out. And now take the radio out. Now the radio comes out. And then disconnect USB, video, antenna, and wiring harness. There we go. Oh, and a microphone. And that is everything removed, and we've had to do all that so that we can mount the gauge here and then run the wire behind this A-pillar panel here under the dashboard to the radio here, where we are going to tap into this harness. Of course, we're not going to touch any of the factory wiring. I hate doing that, but we will tap into this aftermarket harness that I've had to wire in anyway for the radio. And then that should be that. And what I'm thinking is I might even just pull this wiring harness out of the car and then solder in the gauge wires outside of the car so that I don't have to work in this kind of tight-ish space here. But we'll leave that for now, get everything run through the way it should be run through first, and then finish that off last. Right, so before we put all this stuff in the car, I'm first going to show you kind of what this setup is going to look like, since it's going to be more difficult to do that when we're in the car, since we're going to have to run wires under the dashboard and tuck things away in places you can't really see. So it'll be easier to show you on the table. So first of all, we will take out these. So this is the wideband controller, but it's also the controller that will power the gauge. And then I believe this is for analog output, which we're not going to use. This wire here is mainly for data logging purposes, which we don't really need. Next up is this bag. And this is for the boost part of the gauge. So vacuum line connects here, and then this wiring harness will run from this boost output. It's not a boost controller, it's just something that reads pressure. So anyway, we'll run it from that, and this will go directly to the gauge at the bottom there. So this doesn't communicate with this. However, we need power to go to the gauge, and that is what this wiring harness is for. And so this will go from this port here in this box, and this end will go and get soldered into the wiring harness in the radio. And then this wiring harness will go from the box here into the gauge. And then this, as you can probably guess by this connector, is for the O2 sensor. So this is going to get plugged in at the top here. And then that is the setup. So this is going to be under the dashboard somewhere, maybe close to the pedals, kind of how I had mounted it in this car. And then this goes under the car to meet the O2 sensor. This goes to the radio, that goes to the gauge, and then this goes to the boost. And I'm going to connect this vacuum line under the dashboard to the vacuum line that goes to the map sensor in the ECU. Which, yes, I know that can be a slight concern because there will be some interference, but I'm going to try and avoid that by making this line as short as possible. So I'm going to start by installing this first, and I'm going to run this wire under the dashboard and try to get it as close to the ECU as possible, so we can run as short of a vacuum line as possible. So that way we'll have the least amount of interference between this and the ECU, which, let's be real, the ECU's reading is more important than this is. Yes, I should run this little device off of another vacuum port, but I'm feeling lazy and I don't want to run another wire through the firewall if I can help it. So now you know the setup, you know how all of this is going to look. Now we can go ahead and get all of this installed. Alright, so here's the gauge pod, and the gauge just goes in there. Oh, that's what this little rubber thing is for. And there we go. And it just pops in there. Right, we've got these couple of wires, so I'm going to run them through the bottom here. Plug into the gauge. And there we go. Right, now before I stick the gauge pod on, I'm going to run these wires under the dash here. Down here. I think I've got one of them. Let's bring it down here. Aha, there it is. Pull the wires through. There we go. Yeah, I'd say that's a good spot for the gauge. All right, I'll put the A-pillar trim back on. All right, that'll work. And there we go. So here is the gauge. This is its final resting place. Now that's done, we have the actual gauge in position. Now we need to run all of the wires. So I'll leave this wire alone for now. That goes to the box. This is the wire that goes to that boost readout device. So I'm going to run this wire under the dash and try and get it as close to the ECU as possible. And it looks like I can probably just get it right up to the ECU and then tee off a very short vacuum line from the ECU there. So this works out quite perfectly. So here is the little boost readout thing hooked up. And as you can see, the tee off is about, maybe an inch, maybe an inch and a half long. So I really doubt this is going to interfere at all with the readout that goes to the ECU. I mean, look how short this is. And I still have plenty of wire to spare. I also still have to find a good way of putting this ECU up. I had it zip tied here and then kind of up and out of the way for a while, but I don't really like that. So I may need to build something or make some kind of mount to put this up nicely. I don't know. I'll figure that out at some point. All right, so here is the box controller thing, and here's some 3M double-sided sticky stuff. And I'm thinking to mount it in here somewhere above the pedal, just like I did in the blue Corolla. That seemed to be a good place for it. Man, this is quite an uncomfortable position. And as you can see, there it is. Right, now it's time to do a little bit of wiring. There's plenty length of wire here, so there's no problems. I'm gonna go ahead, pull this harness out, and then we'll solder these wires on and get everything thrown back in. Oh, right, I forgot the backup camera wire wasn't disconnectable like that. I'm pretty sure the last time I connected this, I didn't solder it, I just spliced it together. Which, yep, so I'll just break them apart. Probably gonna add a little connector here so that I can disconnect this at any time. Alright, so the wires that we need here are black, yellow, red, and orange. Alright, and it's got power, yep. Let it warm up. There we go. Probably used a bit much. All right. And last one. And that's the wires connected. And now we'll just wrap them in electrical tape, which, yes, I probably should be using heat shrink instead. It's just better. But I've never really had much of a problem with electrical tape to begin with. And there we have it. Gauge wiring and radio wiring now connected. Forever. I've been a bit resistant to soldering in some of my car projects before. That's mainly out of laziness. But the more I study about electrical systems and electronics, etc., the more appreciation I have for doing things properly and making them work and last for a long time. So I'm no longer lazy. I actually solder my stuff now. So let's put this back in the car and then we're well on our way to the finish line. And with that, all of the wires have been plugged in. It's currently a rat's nest here. I will clean all of this up. Don't worry, I'm not leaving it like this because this is terrible the way it is now. Last piece of the puzzle now, besides having to vacuum clean everything, is connecting the O2 sensor. You know, the main reason why I bought the gauge to start off with. Now, we can't do anything with the wires right now because we first have to install the O2 sensor. And that means getting under the car and getting at the exhaust so that we have somewhere to put this. So let's go do that. Alright, so there is the O2 clamp installed. I only plan to run it like this temporarily since I do plan on putting in a new header and replacing all this pipe here, so I didn't really feel like going to the exhaust shop to get a bung welded on here. This will do the job for now. So all that's left is to put the O2 sensor in here, and then I'm going to run it through either this grommet or this grommet. I think this one goes through the floor. Run it through this grommet inside the car so I can plug it in to the harness that's already in there, and then that's everything done. One problem with this being like this, which I want to mention, is the fact that it's kind of angled a little bit downwards. So for O2 sensors, typically you want to angle them a little bit upwards. I mean, I guess this one in this factory position is about flat. Maybe it's a little bit angled up, but this here is angled down, and that is not good because the problem with having an O2 sensor angled down like that is that it gives the opportunity for condensation to kind of surround this and pool up, and that can damage the O2 sensor. But I'm going to take my risk here. I'm going to chance it like this. Since I didn't want to remove the exhaust to drill the hole, the only way I could drill was by kind of angling like this, otherwise the drill wasn't going to fit. So I figure I mentioned that. Not an ideal setup here with it, one being a clamp and two having us kind of angled down. The O2 sensor's kind of got two things working against it there. Anyway, all we need to do now is get the O2 sensor hooked up, run it through the floor, get it installed in the exhaust, and then that's the install done, besides just tucking away a few wires. And then we can plug the battery back in and see if it works. O2 sensor down here. I have the connector up here, kind of out of the way. There wasn't really a good place for the connector inside the car. It would be kind of bulging through the carpet. I'm gonna have to keep an eye on this because it's kind of just adhesive on here, but if this, well, as you can see, the adhesive has already failed. So I need to come up with a better way of sticking that there. But it is plugged in, so we can test and make sure that the O2 sensor is working. Now we just put the interior back together, and then this is all done. Right, so before I go ahead and set the car down, one of you in my last video made a comment that my tires were on backwards. And as you can see, if we look at the rotation symbol, it is backwards. This rotation symbol is going that way, and it's on this side of the car. So I have mounted my tires backwards. Now, to the person that commented that, I've forgotten your name because I forgot to screenshot and save it. Thank you. You have a very sharp eye. I mean, this is my car and I didn't notice it. So I guess that kind of says a lot about how attentive I am. I don't know how I let this happen, but I did. It's quite embarrassing because, I mean, it's tires. Mounting tires is like anybody could do it, but that's what I get for not paying attention, I guess. So while the car is up here on jack stands, I'm gonna fix that. Now the arrow faces the right direction, and all is well. I'm gonna have to make sure this doesn't happen again, because I have other tires that are also directional. These aren't my only directional set of tires. Alright, so now it's time for the test. Will the gauge turn on? I mean, I've already started and moved the car, so I know for a fact that the answer to that question is yes, it will turn on, and it does work. And this is also normal. Every time you turn the car on anytime this gets power. This will do this for 30 seconds to warm up the sensor. That's totally normal, not malfunctioning or anything. All right, so the gauge is currently reading 14, 13, let's say about 14.0. And it's supposed to be 14, 6, 7, 8, supposed to be high 14s, and this is reading low 14s, high 13s. So clearly this is not calibrated. There's a calibration button on the black box I put behind the dash, so I'll just push that and there's a calibration process it does. So that's not a big deal, I will calibrate it. One thing though is this. Can you hear it? Yeah, we've got an exhaust leak. Who could have possibly seen that coming? So all the little issues, this being out of calibration, the exhaust leak, I will take care of off camera, but that's not what this video is about. The video is about the gauge install, which is here, and we have done it now. All right, everyone, that is the gauge install complete, which means this video has now come to its conclusion. Thank you all very much for joining me today in another video with the Corolla XRS, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.